Good evening and a very warm welcome to another instalment of our Enlightening Minds lecture series. My name is Sam Young. I'm one of the assistant heads here at King's and very, very pleased to welcome you tonight on what feels like a proper spring day, although a little bit chilly this evening. We've got a fantastic talk, I think, lined up for you this evening. I'm going to wait to pass over to Hannah and to Alfie to introduce our speaker properly. But yeah, a very warm welcome to everybody that is here this evening in person on site at King's, and also to everybody that is tuning into our live stream as well. For those people who are here in person, we're not expecting one, but if the fire alarm does go off, then you can follow me through that door onto the first 15 rugby pitch where we will gather. We are very fortunate to be able to put these talks on for you free of charge, but a huge thank you to those of you who made a donation as you were booking your ticket. If you haven't done so, then you are able to do that retrospectively through the school website. And finally, for those of you, we will, after our talk this evening, there will be a Q&A. Those people who are tuning in remotely, you will be able to take part in that Q&A. You can submit your questions via X with the hashtag KCS Enlightening Minds. That's hashtag KCS Enlightening Minds. But without any further ado, I'm going to pass over to Hannah and to Alfie to do the proper introduction. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. Today, the King's Association is delighted to welcome Dr Indranil Ghosh as part of the Enlightening Minds series for his talk on inspirational investing. Dr Ghosh is a renowned sustainable investor, award-winning author, and strategic advisor to global leaders.
As the founder of Tiger Hill Capital, he spearheads large-scale nature and climate resilience projects worldwide. His acclaimed book, Powering Prosperity, A Citizen's Guide to Shaping the 21st Century, has earned many prestigious awards globally, and his impressive career includes leadership roles at Mubadala Investment Company, Bridgewater Associates, and McKinsey & Co. Therefore, we are thrilled to have Dr. Ghosh share his experience and insights on investing with us this evening.
Thank you so much, Alfie and Hannah, for that tremendous introduction. Good evening, everyone. It's a pleasure to be with you tonight. I want to start by taking us back in time to the winter of 2009. That might be a little bit beyond the reach of some of the younger members of the audience, but those of you who remember that time will remember it was dark. It was a difficult time. It was the middle of the global financial crisis. I was living in Manhattan, and I had graduated with a PhD in chemical engineering from MIT about a decade before that. And somehow, I had got seduced to the dark side. Despite my love of science and engineering, I'd worked at McKinsey for half a decade, restructuring and growing companies. And after that, I'd gone to Bridgewater, which is a global macro hedge fund run by Ray Dalio, who's become quite well known since then because of all his books and thought leadership. But Bridgewater had really seen the global financial crisis coming, and they had bet the right way, and in fact, made a huge amount of money through that period. And it was at a time when many of their hedge fund competitors were actually blowing up and going out of business. But while myself and my colleagues were safe and secure, things were really falling apart around me. Major banks, household names like Merrill Lynch and Washington Mutual, had really collapsed. And other big banks like Bear Stearns had been broken up and sold to their competitors. In the US, AIG, one of the largest insurance companies, was bailed out by the government. And here in the UK, the Royal Bank of Scotland underwent a similar bailout. So it was really quite an unprecedented time. And in New York, 50,000 direct financial jobs had been lost, and 200,000 jobs had been lost in the city overall, which accounts for about 1 million people, if you include the families that were affected. People that I knew were leaving the city in droves. The economy had gone through a severe downturn. Unemployment was up, by a factor of 2. It had doubled to 10%. And the stock market indices had gone down by 50% in the previous 2 years. So really, it was quite unprecedented, at least in living memory. Now, I had joined the investing industry and business in general as a way to have a positive impact, because investing can unlock some amazing things. Medical research, iconic constructions, buildings, amazing infrastructure like fiber optic networks, and also helping to deploy disruptive technologies into the world like AI. So it was really difficult for me at this time to think, well, I joined this path in order to build things, and yet here I was feeling a part of an industry that might be responsible, or at least partly responsible, for this grave economic crisis. So it was really time for reflection, to take stock and think about what had happened, how to fix it, and what was next. Now, maybe it was just the fact that I was in the wrong part of the finance industry. Maybe it was just in hedge fund trading, you don't actually build anything. You add to market trading and liquidity. But maybe there was actually something wrong with the industry more fundamentally. So I was at a crossroads. And really what I want to do in today's talk is to take you through my own reflection process and take you through the process that the industry has gone through, which mirrors some of the things that I'm going to talk about, to help to reinvent itself. And for me, the goal was to find a more inspirational segment of the investing industry to be in, to see what that path could be. So what I did is, first of all, I tried to derive the lessons from history. What could we learn? And then, hopefully, what would emerge is a path forward to a more inspirational style of investing. And finally, if we achieve the first 2 steps, then I could do what I really wanted to do, which was to build great things together with exceptional entrepreneurs and project developers to build great new companies and great infrastructure that could make a positive difference in the world. So let's start by talking about some of the lessons from history. Now, the global financial crisis came on the heels of the bursting of the housing bubble of the mid-noughties. So maybe a good place to start, actually, is asset bubbles and their crashes and what happens after that. So what I've done here is I've actually plotted some of the big booms and busts over the last 50 years in assets. There was gold in the 70s, the Japanese stock market and the real estate industry, it grew and it crashed. There was the Asian stocks. There was the dot-com bubble and bust of the late 1990s. Then there was Chinese stocks, Bitcoin, AI. I mean, the list goes on. It's actually quite interesting to see how many asset bubbles there are in a relatively short period of time. And the reason they happen quite often is because something new comes along. In the 1600s, it was tulips. They were so amazing that people rushed to buy them and invest in them in droves, and it created a tulip asset bubble. But you can see here that there are so many bubbles where investors behaving in a herd mentality. They see something new. They don't fully understand it. The market doesn't fully understand it. Capital flows in after a first few successful investments, but then there are often too much capital for too few good deals. And as the poor investments begin to surface, again, herd mentality kicks in, and investors withdraw all at the same time, and you get a crash. But only one of these asset bubbles actually led to a global economic crisis, and that was the housing bubble of the mid-noughties. So what was different about this one? Well, the difference was, in this case, the entities that were doing most of the speculation were banks and financial services firms. So they were investing in subprime mortgages, meaning mortgages that shouldn't have been issued in many cases to begin with because they were given to people who weren't creditworthy. And when all of those bad loans piled up, the housing market crashed. But what happened is the banks were left nearly insolvent. And so that meant that they couldn't lend to otherwise healthy businesses in the rest of the economy. So the crisis spread from the housing sector to the banking sector and the financial sector to the rest of the economy. And so we had a full-blown economic crisis. But it was interesting to me at the time, I was maybe in my 30s, to think about how bad was this really, because I only had limited experience. So I looked back 150 years to see what were the biggest economic crises there had been. And it was interesting to see that it was mostly driven by war, US Civil War, World War I, World War II. And if you roll the clock forward a bit, I didn't have the benefit of this insight then, but in 2020, one of the biggest crises was COVID. It was a global pandemic. So in the last 150 years, the biggest drivers of global crisis have been war, disease, and financial crises. So the Great Depression was largely driven by the Wall Street crash of 1929. And you would have thought, well, maybe with such a big event, some controls or regulations would be put in to make sure it didn't happen again. Well, in fact, they were. So as part of the New Deal, or Roosevelt's New Deal in 1933, one of the cornerstones of that was the Glass-Steagall Act. And the point behind this regulation was to create a firewall between commercial banks, on the one hand, and investment banks. So commercial banks are the ones that take people's deposits and then issue loans to individuals and companies, whereas investment banks take capital from investors and then broker or make investments in riskier things. Now, what had been happening in the Wall Street crash was that commercial banks had been taking people's deposits and then investing them in risky assets, in this case, the US stock market. So by putting that firewall in place, the idea was that banks couldn't take your deposit money and invest them in risky things. But then how did the global financial crisis occur with banks being so intimately involved? Well, the reason is that humans have short memories, and their institutions aren't always very strong. So just 66 years after the Glass-Steagall Act and the Great Depression, a guy called Senator Phil Gramm, who was at the time the chairman of the Committee on Banking and Urban Affairs in the US, he introduced a couple of pieces of legislation, 2 bills, the Financial Securities Modernization Act and the Commodity Trading Modernization Act. And essentially what these 2 bills did was to repeal the Glass-Steagall Act and break that firewall. Now, just even less than 10 years later, what that meant was that banks started to speculate, this time in the housing bubble, and create another economic crisis. Why was he able to pass that bill? Well, there was a lot of lobbying, of course, and people claimed that banks in other countries were being deregulated and the US didn't have the same competitive advantages. But maybe it had something to do with the fact that some of Senator Graham's biggest donors, like Enron, stood to gain the most from the repeal of these acts. And maybe it was partly because his wife happened to be on the board of Enron. So, very cautionary tale here, that when you let special interests and corporate interests get too close to policymaking and regulation, you can unlock a Pandora's box where devastating things can happen. So was that it? Was it just financial regulation that would solve everything in the investment and the finance industry? We had to dig a little bit deeper. So the next question was, okay, we have a crisis. What are we going to do next? Now, this is a graph of public debt versus GDP as a percentage of GDP. And you notice some interesting things going on. If you look around 2010, there's a massive increase in public debt in the US and the UK. And again, I didn't have the benefit of this foresight then, but when you look at COVID, public debt went up again. And this is because during the global financial crisis, governments really had to step in. they had to inject capital into the failing banks to keep them solvent so they could keep lending and hope that they would recover. But they also had to implement very large fiscal programs, which means investing, or rather funding, shovel-ready projects, infrastructure projects, public works, social housing, to create public sector jobs to make up for the jobs that have been lost in the private sector, to tide over the economy in this period of crisis. But that came at a big price, which was the steep increase in public debt. What's so bad about debt, or public debt for that matter? Well, basically, whenever you have high debt of any kind, whether it's an individual, a company, or a country, you've borrowed from the future. So you have to pay the future back before you can invest in further growth. And so what you end up doing is having to pay, as a government, as the government, you have to start paying interest on all these loans and paying back the principal before you can invest more in healthcare, education, infrastructure, and all these things that are going to help drive growth. So what had happened is basically the governments had taken on the burden of the debt that had the bad debt that had previously been on the balance sheet of the banks. Now, you can see from here that there's a very cautionary tale about what happens if you don't manage high public debt, and that's the case of Japan. Remember that there was an asset bubble in Japan in the late 80s, the real estate market and the stock market crashed there. Created a lot of bad loans in the balance sheet of banks in Japan. Fortunately, it was mostly contained within that country and didn't have a global effect. But the Japanese central bank had to basically start paying off, or start rather injecting money into those banks to restructure the debt, also trying to create fiscal stimuluses to crank up the economy. But it was at a time when birth rates in Japan were falling. Young working age population was beginning to shrink. The population was aging. They also had restrictive immigration policies, so they couldn't get workers from outside. So Japan began to fall into this trap where they had large debts to pay off. They didn't have enough of an engine for growth. There was low consumer confidence. People weren't buying, they were saving. And so the government had to keep on issuing more and more debt to hold the economy together. That's happened now for 35 years straight. GDP in Japan has barely moved over that time. Growth has been flat. And this is a great example, I think, of what could happen if we don't manage public debt. But what does this have to do with inspirational investing? Well, if we look at the countries like the US and the UK that brought down public debt after the Second World War, that's an interesting dynamic which is going the other way. How did that debt come down? Well, it was a period of great reconstruction after the Second World War. More money was also put into the welfare state for the first time, behind healthcare, education, infrastructure, social housing. Housing in particular made it easier for people to have bigger families. So there was a baby boom, more workers coming into the workforce, more skilled, which created a cycle of growth that allowed those countries to pay down the public debt and invest in the future. So I guess for me, the real question was, is there another type of reconstruction that we can be doing now, in 2010, now 2020 and 25, that can help not just create localized benefit from good investment, but actually help at a macroeconomic level, bring down the debt? And I think there is. As we stare down the barrel of a climate crisis and we face high inequality in society, what about the investments that we should be making in renewable energy, in more regenerative agriculture, reforestation to restore nature and biodiversity, not to mention all of the other investments in technology that can have huge productivity increases? But also, what about those access investments we can be making to help create more access for lower income communities and people to better education and health, to connect them digitally, and to create more financial inclusion? there's so much that we can do to invest in creating a better future, which could help with the overall macroeconomy. But then the question was, who's going to pay for that? Because we know that these economies are somewhat indebted then as well as now. Well, we have, as a world, $20 to $25 trillion of global tax base that we could work with. That seems like a big number, but it seems like it's already all accounted for. How can we get more out of that to help with catalytic investments to create these more sustainable projects? Or maybe what we could look at is what global private wealth, which stands at $450 trillion. This is all your and my wealth, right? It sits in pension funds, it sits in the stock market, it sits in asset management firms, but ultimately, it's also our real estate, our land, our savings. How about steering some of this large number into sustainable investments and trigger positive growth? Well, looking at all of this information, and a lot more, which I don't have time to talk about, it seemed to me that at least the fog was parting, and there was some sort of a path to more inspirational investing somewhere. But it seemed like also it was still quite a ways away. As I began to think about things on a more personal level, what did I want to do in investing? It seemed like I wanted to focus less on transactions and more on co-creation. By that, I mean working with entrepreneurs, working with project developers to build some of these big projects like renewable energy and reforestation and things like that. But maybe what I should have done is just joined an infrastructure fund or something. But I actually wanted a bit more than that. I wanted to be at the forefront of technological adoption. We have a lot of great science and engineering. We have great prototypes. But in the industry, we call the valley of death, the capital valley of death that you have to cross to take those prototypes and make them into actually useful products and scale them up and sell them to large customer base and have the impact that the technologies can have. There's not enough capital for that. But that's really what drives the impact. So I wanted to be doing more of that. But maybe I should have just joined a VC firm. But there was more. In the 20 years leading up to 2009, we'd had this period of incredible globalization. Trade barriers going down, but also new countries emerging like China and India and then Vietnam and on and on. And we were able to do miraculous things like offshore manufacturing, service jobs, even R&D to these offshore countries. But by 2009, people were beginning to ask the question, what about local economies in the developed world? What happens to the manufacturing there? And what can we do to actually invest in those locations to help revitalize them and re-engineer them into industries that will be strong in the future? I wanted to make sure I was doing something in terms of local development. But the thing that was troubling me the most, actually, was this idea of shareholder primacy. This was an idea that was coined by Milton Friedman, famous Nobel Prize-winning economist in the 1960s and 70s at Chicago. This is the idea that the reason that a firm or a company exists is to create value, returns, profits for his shareholders, for the equity shareholders of the company. And that may be the only objective that a firm should have. Now, by 2009, in Western capitalism, this had become pretty much a doctrine. Okay, no one even questioned this. But if you were looking at the world as it was, it needs a lot of investment in infrastructure. There needed to be a price paid on the environmental extraction that was happening to fuel these profits, as well as some of the things that might need to be done to create more cohesion in society and address inequality. None of these things were really priced properly in the market. So that needed to be addressed. So as I looked at this wish list, it was like, this is not about moving from one job to another. There's a lot more going on here. What needs to go on here is system change. We need to change the system. well, if there's anything that we know about system change, is it takes a heck of a long time, unless there's a big crisis that creates a jolt for humanity and they change things a lot more quickly. I always think about the amusing example, I find it amusing, about Zoom and digital communications. We had Zoom for a decade and other technology like that, but it took COVID to come along before we all started using it, and using it to communicate with each other in the workplace and realize actually some things can be done quite productively from home. And finally, there was a bit more social acceptance that it's okay to work from home or have a hybrid working system, and even companies began to embrace it. Kind of had to be honest. But it took COVID, a crisis of that magnitude, to actually push us into the digital and hybrid working, format. Now, I wasn't really willing to wait 20 or 30 years for the system to change or to wait for the next crisis. I was younger back then, and quite ambitious. So I wanted to do something there and then. Fortunately for me, the phone rang from a headhunter, a recruiter in the Middle East, and they said, what do you think about leaving your nice job in New York, flying half the way around the world to the desert in Abu Dhabi, working for a company called Mubadala, I'd never heard of. And by the way, what they're doing is they have 60 billion under management, and they're trying to build new industries from scratch in Abu Dhabi to diversify that economy away from being just an oil and gas economy. I thought, wait a minute, probably co-create something here. I'll probably, be involved in the adoption of some interesting technology. I'm definitely contributing to the building of a local community, in fact, a city-state. And the most interesting thing about Mubadala, though, is it was set up from day one as having a double bottom line mandate. It meant that, yes, of course, they were investing, so they had to make a good return on their investments. But the second bottom line was all about having other impact, positive impact on the country, increasing non-oil GDP by building up other sectors of manufacturing and technology and healthcare, impacting social outcomes, better health outcomes, more engagement of women in the workforce. There was a whole series of other metrics that had to be hit by each investment. So this was fascinating, and actually, it was around this time that the words impact investing began to be coined, or development investing. And there were a few bold organizations like Mubadala who were doing it, or funds like Actis here in London. And I was intrigued. So I hopped on a plane with my wife and my 3-month-old son, who's now actually sitting in the audience here, is Kabir. He's in upper fifth now. And we took Kabir to Abu Dhabi, and we all as a family had a great time. It was really amazing what we did there. Non-oil GDP in Abu Dhabi has gone from 40% in 2007 to 54% in 2024. So they've been very successful. And some of the things that I was able to participate in as the head of strategy at Mubadala were some amazing projects like Imperial College Diabetes Center, where we took the know-how from Imperial College here in the UK. We did a joint venture with them and built a series of clinics around the UAE because diabetes is a very highly prevalent and challenging disease in the Middle East and in the UAE as well. But not only were these clinics extremely profitable, they obviously had a very big health impact, but it was greatly helped by the 2013 Health Act that was enacted in Abu Dhabi that mandated universal health coverage for all private sector employees. So what that meant was that new facilities like the Diabetes Center and many other things that Mubadala built and other organizations built, that healthcare was accessible to everybody, not just those who could pay out of pocket. There were other very interesting projects like Sanad Aerotech, where Abu Dhabi realized that they had a big airport. It was growing, thousands of planes flying through every year. So why not build a local company that would help with the maintenance and repair of those aircraft, help with providing spare parts, and leasing the aircraft and the parts. So Sanad became a very successful investment as well and contributed to that diversification into knowledge-intensive and technical sectors. Of course, not everything was a success. There were some learning moments as well. Masdar is Abu Dhabi's future energy platform, which some of you may have heard of, and has been very successful investing in offshore wind and large solar projects, some of it here in the UK. But it also tried to build the first zero-carbon city, Masdar City. But unfortunately, that was about 10, maybe 20 years ahead of its time, and that didn't go so well. Something else that didn't go so well was Abu Dhabi's dream of building a semiconductor fabrication cluster in the desert in Abu Dhabi. And they invested in a company called Global Foundries that did pretty well. But they were never able to bring the fabs to Abu Dhabi. And that's because semiconductors is a highly specialized and technical field where talent is key. And that talent is clustered in a few locations in the world, like Taiwan, California, Germany. And if you want some of that talent to come to Abu Dhabi, you're going to have to pay them so much to take a risk on a new project that it's going to cripple the whole endeavor, and it's going to be unprofitable. So that had to be dropped. But what I did learn is that there is a repeatable formula for building these scalable projects, even the ones that require some proactive system change. You have to bring together technology and innovation, like we did from Imperial College. The social attitudes have to be supportive. Of course, there was a big medical need in Abu Dhabi, and in the case of hybrid working and digital, eventually people thought it was okay to work from home once they got used to it. So you need that social support, but you also need policies and institutions. So the Healthcare Act was so important in 2013 to make this whole thing work. Now the Imperial College Diabetes Centers were accessible to everybody. They could have a broad impact. But the other thing that you also need is capital. Now in Abu Dhabi, that's in abundance. So they're lucky that they can fund these sorts of projects. But where are you going to get the capital from if your country is highly indebted or doesn't have the resources? And even if you have the capital, don't you need something of a framework that tells you what the goal is? What are you shooting for in terms of sustainable development? Don't you need the investing industry to adapt itself to meet those goals? Well, fortunately, what happened in around 2015 is the UN actually did something remarkable. It managed to ratify the 17 UN Sustainable Development Goals, which for the first time that I'm aware of in the history of humanity, we put a common language and a common set of metrics around what we wanted to achieve as a species that's positive and sustainable. We wanted to solve for poverty, for hunger, for clean water, address the climate crisis, address social inequalities. So first of all, now there's a framework. So we could actually have a common conversation, which is so important. But then someone asked, how much is this all going to cost? So the UN went off and did some calculations and came back with a number, which has been highly debated. It ranges anywhere from $3 trillion a year to 7, but let's say it's 5. And this is an annual cost that they said would be required at least until 2030 and probably beyond. Now we're getting a sense of what a big number means, right? This is how much we need to invest every year. Our global tax base and social security is 20 to 25 trillion a year. So we'd have to take a quarter of our current tax budget, stop spending on what we're spending on, and apply it to these things, or we'd have to increase our tax base by 25% if it's the public sector that we're relying on to do all of this. Well, it's hard to raise taxes by even 1%, so that's unlikely to happen. Government at best is going to be able to do very important things: regulation, set incentives, tax incentives, seed investments for different sorts of things. But ultimately, we're going to have to steer some of that 450 trillion of private wealth into big scalable projects that are going to allow us to address these sustainable development goals. and hopefully create the kind of sustainable growth that we need to solve some of our macroeconomic problems. So now things are becoming a little bit clearer, okay? Lessons from history, some sort of a more tangible path to inspirational investing, but still not quite there. But I thought maybe I should put my money where my mouth is and actually become an entrepreneur myself and stop working for other people and try to build great things together with other entrepreneurs and other project developers, which had been my dream, actually. So this seemed like a good time to try that. So I came back to the UK, and I started Tiger Hill Capital. And it's actually my wife who came up with the name. So you might wonder, why is it called Tiger Hill Capital? Well, the idea was simple, actually. We both come from the state of West Bengal in India, and you probably heard of the district of Darjeeling, where the amazing tea comes from. Well, around there is this mountain resort called Tiger Hill, and people go there to rest and luxuriate and relax. But on a clear morning, if you wake up early enough, if you catch the sun, the rising sun just right, the sun illuminates the Himalayas. And right in the middle is the majestic peak of Everest. And so the idea behind Tiger Hill Capital was that we would work with amazing founders and project developers and take their ideas and their early products and take those companies that were more at the Tiger Hill level, 2,500 meters, help them to get to Everest, to become an impact unicorn. And we do that by working with partners or companies over a long period of time, helping them build up their management teams, helping them accelerate their revenues by connecting them with our corporate network of contacts, as well as raising capital. And we take interest in those companies in terms of carried interest or equity on many occasions. So let me tell you about a few of the projects we've been doing, and I think this is where life began to get really interesting. And a couple of examples to give you a sense of what's possible and why it's inspirational, at least to me, and maybe to you. The first one I want to talk about is a project which is about 100,000 hectares of bamboo afforestation in the Philippines. Now, the Philippines has been ravaged since the 1960s by 4 million hectares of deforestation. A lot of that is from logging, some of it illegal, some of it is from clearing of the forest by tribes to create space for subsistence agriculture. Now, we're working with a really amazing company there who has an incredible business model. What they do is they take deforested land and rewild it again. They plant native trees, and among those trees, they also plant large tracts of bamboo. So, first of all, what this does is it sequesters a lot of carbon because of the trees growing, and it also actually restores nature and biodiversity because there's a lot of native trees that go into this planting scheme. But then the bamboo poles, or the bamboo plants, as they mature, they form these enormous poles. This is giant clumping bamboo, by the way. This isn't the invasive running bamboo that you hear about, sort of going from your garden to someone else's. These bamboo species actually stay in one place. And over the years, they form all of these poles, 50, 60 poles per plant sometimes. And you can come along and cut these poles, and the poles regenerate because the bamboo is actually a grass, so the stump grows back into another pole. So you've got 100 years of timber resource. And the company we're working with takes these poles and makes them into structural timber products. It means that you can build multi-story buildings out of these structural bamboo timber products and replace the use of steel and concrete. So it's actually an incredible value chain. You're capturing carbon at the beginning of it. You're restoring forests and nature and biodiversity. The projects also pay for other social benefits like healthcare or providing transportation for children to go to schools. We're putting in Starlink to create digital connectivity and digital payments in these communities. But then, the fiber from the bamboo actually creates sustainable building materials, which downstream also mean that there's less use of steel and concrete. When these forests are mature, about 10 years from now, they'll be producing about $5 billion of revenue in timber products. And they will have created 10,000 planting jobs and forest maintenance jobs and 2,000 factory jobs with an investment of about $1 billion. But where's that money coming from? I think this is the really interesting part of the story, actually. Not that the rest isn't. But it's actually coming through carbon credits, which is a whole new form of finance that's just beginning to take off. So it turns out that when companies like our partners in the Philippines plant trees and they grow, it sequester carbon, that's all monitored by a registry body or a standards body that comes and makes sure that that's happening, that the company is doing what it said it did. And when that happens, carbon credits are generated. And they can be purchased by other companies like tech companies or airline companies, energy companies, if they need those carbon offsets to put against their net zero targets. Or they can actually purchase them and sell them to somebody else. But the idea is you created a financial pool, a pool and a tool to help with these types of investments. So what we've done with this project is we've been able to raise development capital from carbon buyers who say, we'll give you the money to grow the forests, and in return, you give us the carbon credits that we can offset against our account. So that's kicking off this entire value chain. I'll share another one with you. This is another very interesting one that I particularly like because it's all about the adoption of disruptive technology. Now, you've all heard about solar power, of course. We've had that for a while now. And conventional solar panels consist of polycrystalline silicon, which is stuck on an aluminum backplane. And you see these spread out on fields, maybe even on a roof. And they've gotten very effective, cost-effective and efficient over the years. And in many parts of the world, they can actually generate electricity on a par or even cheaper than hydrocarbon sources. But imagine what would happen if you could create a solar sheet, not just a panel, but a sheet of plastic with semiconductor carbon printed on it with inkjet printers. And that sheet would be 40 times lighter, 50 times cheaper per unit area than a conventional solar panel. And even though it wouldn't convert as much solar energy into as much electricity as a conventional solar panel, because of how low cost it is, the cost of actually producing a unit of electricity would be halved. On top of that, every 5 to 10 years, you could take the sheet, give it back to the manufacturer, they'd wash off the carbon ink, respray it or reprint it, and give it back to you to put back on your roof or on the side of a building or over a greenhouse or even on the top of your car eventually. It's that light. Well, the company we're working with is an Australian company that's done exactly that, and we're helping them to build their first gigafactory here in the UK. And the funding will likely come from real estate companies and investment funds, and particularly the real estate companies have a lot to gain from this. So that's another example of where I believe we'll get mass adoption of a technology because it's so effective, but because it's so low cost. So unlike a lot of other technologies which start off expensive and they need to be subsidized, and then you hope that you get enough subsidies for the cost to come down, and then it can be disseminated into the rest of the economy. That's what we did with solar, the original solar. This is actually highly impactful and highly economic from day one. So I think this is inspiring. This is the kind of investing I was always wanting to do. And why is it that way? Well, for me, running my own business, I get to choose my own missions. That's important for me. I get to choose who I work with. Some of these amazing founders, incredibly resilient people, the stuff that they go through to develop these technologies, sometimes over years, all the naysayers that they have to put up with. I just find it extraordinary. They're really built in a different way. And they find a way to make it work. And it's really a privilege to work with them. Smart and resilient and incredible people. I get to work with science and technology again. That's great. It's not purely the dark side. And we're delivering tremendous impact. But what I really like is that a toolkit that I learned early in my career and which I really enjoy is an analytical toolkit, finance and investing tools They give me the framework by which to analyze all these diverse set of investment opportunities and hopefully make really good decisions and help our clients. So, how does this now make me feel? Bad? Dangerous? Or maybe just inspired? Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Ghosh, for giving us such relevant and inspirational insight into the industry of investing. I think now we're going to move on to the question and answer section of this evening. So if anyone in the audience has any questions that they want to offer, or anyone online as well, we can definitely facilitate that. No problem. Well, we'll start off with our questions. Dr. Ghosh, we were wondering, how would you suggest someone gets into the industry of investing from not having much experience in the first place?
Well, I think I give you the same advice that maybe a lot of teachers give you, which is that all the useful stuff that you actually do is not always in the classroom. That you have to be really interested in what's going on around you in the world. And to be interesting, you need to be interested. Now, one of the best things that I ever was taught was if I was going to be investing, into companies, it was really good to get into the head of business owners. So I had to think like them. I had to understand what their frustrations were, what they really needed. But I also needed to understand finance and the technical aspects of that and business to be able to help them, achieve their goals, overcome their barriers. But until you actually think like them, you don't really able to have the empathy to help them. So part of what you need to do is, I think, build a lot of tools and expertise, no question. Take an interest in economics, start reading The Economist. All the jargon that you don't understand, ask your teachers and your friends and say, what does this mean and what that mean? Leave no stone unturned on the technical stuff. That's going to be important. But I would say the most important thing is to talk to people. Talk to people who run businesses. Small, large, doesn't matter. So actually you learn a lot from, both ends of the spectrum, right? Maybe get involved, in entrepreneurship. Do some internships there. But what I'm saying is you've got to learn about the real world, the technical skills, and the companies before you can really be an effective investor. Because I think you need to be able to know how to help a company and what it really needs to give them the solution that they need.
Thank you very much.
My question is sort of similar, but what do you think is your top number one piece of advice that you could give to the students here at King's to do later on when they want to get into the investing industry?
Again, it's not going to come from your IB at A-level and GCSEs. It's going to come, well, some of it will. Maybe the economics and the maths helps and that kind of thing. But really, you need to do internships. And I think, there's a splendid new gentleman, Mr. Gori, who's here basically to build up, the pathways that you have to find internships. You have to really go and experience it. This is not, theoretical stuff. This is stuff that you learn from, active combat. You have to go, work with investment firms, see what they do, see how they work, see if you like it, see if it's for you, because it might seem theoretically interesting. The content might appeal to you, but when you actually get into the day-to-day nuts and bolts of it, the lifestyle and what you have to do may not be for you, or isn't certainly not for everyone. But really, this is a full contact sport. Any profession is. So you have to go and play the sport, not watch it on a video.
Thank you very much. Now to the floor if everyone has any questions.
By the way, I do have some books. Called Powering Prosperity, which I happened to write a few years ago. There's one of these signed copies, or maybe more, to the best question from a young person. Because the older people should just be setting an example, right? We can't give them books. But the young people. I could just take the books home.
What's the largest challenge you've had to face in your career, and how did you get over it?
Yeah, good question. You might have that book then. It's a tough one. There have been many challenges. I think one of the biggest challenges in what I've done is it's all about facing the naysayers, right? So back in 2009, when I was taking the job at Mubadala, I actually called all my friends who were at Goldman and Morgan Stanley and wherever, and I said, I'm taking this job at Mubadala, and they do double bottom line investing, which means you get to make money on investments and do good for the country. This is awesome. They're like, that's never going to work. You can't make money and do good. That's just, that's Milton Friedman doctrine. That's just never going to happen. See you in a couple of years when you fail. Okay. Then there's Tiger Hill Capital. It took a little while for that to get going. People just didn't get impact investing for such a long time. But you've got to keep at it. You've got to stay at the forefront. You've got to keep experimenting. You can't expect to scale up like everybody else's business who's doing something that's more mainstream. But eventually, if you keep at it, I think you reap the rewards. That's the toughest thing. It's the naysayers. Changing the system, being part of the change.
You talked earlier about young people having to go out there and practicing or sort of seeing how the investments happen. What sort of skills, young people sitting here, would you say are the ones that you would really like to see in an inspirational investor? What are sort of the things that would be really good to have? And they recognize that in themselves to then be able to go out there and say, okay, I really might be good at this.
In the kind of investing I'm talking about, which is not all of investing, okay? I think you have to have a mindset which is geared towards, I want to build something, right? It doesn't have to be a gizmo or a prototype of something, but you need to have the mindset that I'm going to create. I'm going to show up, and there's no blueprint, there's no Lego manual. I'm going to just take a box of Lego and build something cool, right? And I'm going to work with a bunch of people, trade ideas, figure out how to build something really cool with a team of people. And I'm going to have to sell that cool thing, that idea, to all the naysayers who don't think it can be of any use to anybody. Once young people can start hardwiring that as a way of behaving, it's a behavior, actually, it's a mindset, then you're really on your path to doing, this type of work. And that's what I look for in the people that, I want to work with and the people that I hire. They've got to have the builder's mindset. They've got to throw away the rule book and just say, I'm going to create something that might not have ever been done before, and it's going to work. It's amazing resilience that takes, I think.
Thank you very much for the talk. It was really interesting, and the sort of virtuous side of what you do is very refreshing as well. I'm interested actually in what you think about Bitcoin and its future.
You say, I'm afraid I actually don't know the first thing about Bitcoin, so I can't answer that one, I'm afraid. One has to draw certain boundaries around what one knows and can talk about, and Bitcoin's just out of that, I'm afraid.
It's not Bitcoin, but in terms of areas or sectors or regions, which do you think is going to be one of the faster growing ones? Obviously you talked about renewable energy, but I don't know, recycling or waste. What do you feel the most dynamic areas to be involved in as an impact investor?
I think it's very early days, but we're having some traction on solving the climate crisis. We're not acting anywhere near as fast as we need to be. The speaker that came on Enlightening Minds who talked about climate change was dead on. We're way behind. But at least what we see there is that we sort of know what to do. We just have to do things a lot faster with a lot more capital, right? Where I think the bigger challenges are, which are more of an untrodden path, is how we're going to solve some of our social inequality problems. I mentioned some things which are around making it more easy for lower income, communities or people to access the things that we all have, right? In this room anyway. That can help. But really the world is in a really tense place right now, right? We have gone through the era of the peace dividend, where there were more liberal democracies emerging all the time, and now it's the opposite. There's more illiberal democracies and strong man or strong woman leaders emerging in some of the most unexpected places, by the way, like the US. And that's being driven by social tension, inequality. People want something different. So they want solutions to their problem, but they're, as in the past, they're turning towards the loudest voice may not be the most sage voice. And we're seeing all kinds of policies right now, some of it I hinted at in my talk, which have not succeeded in the past and will probably not succeed in the future, coming to the forefront. I don't know if investing can solve that. It can play a role. But I think that's the bigger challenge. Now, you asked I think you meant where are the opportunities, right? Now, again, access investments can be part of it. But I think, really going into communities at the sort of the ground level, like I described in the Philippines, but here, in seaside towns, in old industrial hubs, like in the northeast of England, I think what we can do is really power investment into individual locations. Like, how can we take the infrastructure that's already there, the skilled labor that's already there, right? How can we retool them for new industries of the future, a bit like they're doing in Abu Dhabi? How can we attract more capital for that and really solve problems on the ground level so that the social problems are solved through, economic development rather than blunt political instruments? I think that's where the opportunity really is for the future that's going to have a real impact, okay? Well, there are various things that you can draw upon, like carbon investing that I mentioned. So a lot of these investments that you could do in an industrialized place could be low carbon projects. Doing something that was previously carbon intensive, like making cement, and making a lower carbon version of cement. Initially, it's going to be a little bit more expensive, so you're going to need some government support for the first couple of factories, or some other source of capital that is not purely return seeking. But for second, third, fourth, fifth plants, that's when private capital can come in and really scale that up and create a hub. Now, it also needs to be supported by good things, like technical colleges to train up the workforce again for something new, and all those supportive measures. And usually, those sorts of clusters are often encouraged and facilitated by non-profit organizations that are specifically set up to redevelop an area. And they usually have a few different types of stakeholders in them. So in the advisory committee of such a cluster organization, you'll have universities, you'll have local businesses, you'll have local investors, you'll have bigger companies, corporates. All of them have to have a common interest in what could happen in that place and say, we're going to encourage this through capital or through other support. We're going to buy the products that are going to be made here and so forth. So there's well-documented approaches for creating clusters in this way. It does need a bit of catalytic capital, but once you get it going, you do get the Cambridge Science Parks. You do get the sort of AI cluster that you're getting, for example, in Western Pennsylvania. I'm forgetting the name of the town now, where Carnegie Mellon is, Pittsburgh. That was a 20-year effort like this to turn a coal city into a robotics hub, and it's working.
With kind of recent changes in the political climate, does it make it difficult, impact investing? There's a bit more of a rollback to the primacy of the shareholders, right? Some litigations and et cetera on even asset managers. if they're not focused on that. There's that, and other things like carbon pricing, highly political, right? So the minute there is no focus on actually paying a price for pollution, then you kind of think, where will this pricing land? And then that has an impact on companies which are kind of built, assuming there's a market for that. So how do you reckon dealing with these kind of changes?
There's no question that it's going to put some brakes on the progress, right? But you look at some of the policies in the US right now, and you wonder how long they can really last, right? You know, you put up trade barriers, someone else is going to retaliate. That's not good for you, it's not good for them. It's not going to be good at the polling booth. You get rid of half of your government, well, those people also vote, the people you just fired. Are they going to vote for you next time? So there's a real question marks about the sustainability of some of these things, and politics is an ever, swinging seesaw. But I think if you look at the long run, if you look at the companies who aren't, changing course, this is the kind of environment where you weed out the sort of yes people from the people who are real. They're still staying the course. But yes, it's going to come in fits and starts, 2 steps forward, 1 step back. But I do think the overall momentum on a longer term basis has to be and is towards more sustainable investing.
We've got time for one more question. There is one more, but otherwise, I think so.
I do have one more comment on young people. Okay. The young gentleman up there is going to get a copy of my book, whether he wants it or not. Simply because he showed up to the game, right? Showing up is 90% of it. Well done.
Well, thank you very much, everybody, for coming this evening. A huge thank you to Dr. Ghosh as well for such a fascinating and illuminating talk on a topic, I have to say, that about which I knew virtually nothing before this evening. A huge thank you to Mr. Donovan as well for doing all of the AV work, and a huge thank you to the King's Association as well for kind of putting on this talk in collaboration with the school. Thank you very much for coming. There is one more Enlightening Minds talk this term. Put it in your diaries, Thursday the 27th of March. We're very fortunate to welcome Simon Parker, journalist, author, travel writer, who relatively fresh, I think, probably from his cycle across America, is going to be coming in to talk about big politics in small town USA. That's Thursday the 27th of March. Thank you very much for coming. Safe journey home. Thank you very much.